Well, welcome to West End Resilience Live. Today we welcome Gavin Stollar, John Walker and Sam Lyon from CT Group, who will be giving an insight into what the latest data shows about consumer behaviour during COVID-19, not only in the UK, but in markets where COVID-19 became established earlier. The team will look at what the expectations will be from consumers for retail and leisure businesses by analysing changing spending habits, values and priorities. You can, of course, as always, put your questions to them by clicking on the question mark icon at the bottom of your webinar window. But first, let's hear from Jace Tyrrell, Chief Executive of the new West End company. Jace, over to you.
Martin, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. West Enders, members, partners, friends of the West End. I'm actually back in Regent Street today, so I've had a good walk around the district as we start to turn our mind to hopefully reopening in the next couple of weeks. And just on that point, which is not the topic of today's Resilience Live, but there's a lot of questions, understandably, of when particularly non-essential retail can open. So we've had various conversations with ministers and officials in the last 24 hours. So the moment we hear what those guidelines are, and if you can open safely from the 1st of June onwards in the West End, we'll of course keep our members and wider partners updated on that. So today we're turning to resilience of the customer. We are very privileged to have the former Chief Planner of Westminster City Council with us, John Walker, who is now part of CT Group, and we'll be discussing around the consumer resilience, but also, I guess, the more broader citizens resilience and sort of public policy and how this could relate to consumer sentiment and spending and some of those trends we're perhaps going to see as we start to come into reopening and the recovery phase. So thank you very much for joining us once again this afternoon, and delighted to hand over to a former friend of the West End, who I'm sure still is a friend of the West End, John Walker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jason. I'm still working the West End because our offices are in Mayfair. Before I introduce Sam Lyon from CT Partners and Gavin Stollar, who will be joining in the Q&A at the end, for those who know me from my 35 years working at Westminster, I think most people have perceived me as an optimist, and it's always about looking for solutions and opportunity, which is something that the CT Group is all about. We've been doing weekly polling right throughout COVID-19 in Australia, Hong Kong, the USA, India and the UK, and they're all at different stages of the COVID-19 outbreak. And we're going to give you a little bit of insight to what the perceptions are as they go through, and some of them are ahead of us in terms of the outbreak. What you're about to see is just a sample of the research, which Sam is going to lead on. If anybody's interested in other elements, and I did discuss with Jace last week that there may be interest in electric vehicles, that's moving up the agenda because West End residents and businesses have smelt and tasted clean air for the first time in a long time. I'm sure we can set something up. Before I hand over to Sam, just one point I want to make now is that the public expectation is that the government takes a lead on this. They take a lead on fighting COVID, and they're also, the expectation is the government will take the lead on getting out of it and the post-recovery. So there will be more government intervention, and governments right across the globe will be bolder in terms of what they're going to do and what their agendas are going to be. So Sam's going to touch on perceptions and expectations, the economy and business, and consumer habits, and then round up with a few key insights before we go to that Q&A area. So without any further ado, I shall hand you over to Sam.
John, thank you very much, and Jace, thank you very much for having us. Alice, if you could just pop to the next slide and I'll dive straight in. Just to reiterate what John said, we've been polling across the UK, the US, Australia, India and Hong Kong. Now, polling does not and cannot predict the future, but as we've touched on earlier, because we're polling in markets that are more advanced in the pandemic's life cycle, we are starting to see some kind of foresight and precursors to what might happen in the UK, certainly when we look at some of the events in Hong Kong. So I'll be touching on that later. Just in terms of kicking off though, Alice, if you could just pop to the next slide. One of the key things to bear in mind is the differences in those geographies, because it does drive some differences between the two as well. You'll see on graphs that we go through where the blue lines are, that is the US, where the red lines are, that is the UK, and so on down those. But you'll notice obviously from the top right hand corner of that chart, there are clearly differences in where the US and the UK are compared with India, Australia, and Hong Kong. So first of all, Alice, if you could pop to the next slide. In terms of understanding consumer behaviour, it's important to understand where they think the virus is and what stage it's at. So just carry on, Alice. What we see here is that the majority of people in the UK, so that bar with 50% and the bar with 28%, so 78% of people in the UK think we're currently at the peak of the virus. Flip that across to Hong Kong, and you're seeing that almost 40%, just over 40%, believe they're in the latter stages. Now that's in the latter stages, even when they have not had any new infections for a number of days on the trot. So they still don't think that it has disappeared. And it's clear, if you move to the next slide, Alice, that while there was a quick movement from the early stages to peak, which is why you see those very steep lines across the markets, with the exception of India, very quick movement from early stages to peak. There is a long tail in this as far as the public are concerned, and therefore that is affecting their behaviour. The next two slides, Alice, if we move to the first one, is how long people expect social distancing to last. The key thing to note on these slides are how flat the curves are. There is a lot of indecision and uncertainty as to how long social distancing will last. In the UK, the majority of people have it anywhere between 2 months and up to a year. And if you move to the next slide, how long it will take before normal working life returns, well, that's even longer. And in the UK, anywhere between 4 to 6 months and possibly up to 2 years. But what you'll also see is that is fairly consistent across the UK, the US and Australia. Only with only with Hong Kong coming out of lockdown and normal life starting to return, that they're slightly more optimistic that normal life might return within the next 2 to 4 or possibly just over the next 4 months. Now, as the pandemic progresses, and this is a key thing in terms of consumer behaviour, Alice, if you pop to the next slide, major concerns flip from being about health to being about financial and economic. So the long-term damage that it's having to the economy, the stability of their financial situation, their job prospects, and their future financial security. And the next slide is quite a stark indication of what we're seeing in Hong Kong. This is Hong Kong only. So on each of these graphs, the bottom line is this week's track, and the lines above that are each week previously going back. And we've seen a big jump in the last week alone in terms of Hong Kong of how people think it will negatively impact their personal finances, their future financial security and their jobs. So what we're seeing as you come out of lockdown, certainly in Hong Kong, is a greater focus in terms of personal finances and what it means for their financial security. So how do the people in the UK think the economy is doing? Next slide, Alice. The next slide looks at net belief in terms of how the economy is performing. So the bottom graph here is the one to focus on, and it's the red line, and that minus 56%. That means 56% more think the economy is performing poorly than well. And it is way more pronounced in the UK than it is some other comparable markets, such as Australia or Hong Kong, which is the green line and the light blue lines, respectively. And therefore, that obviously, in terms of future financial concerns and their consumer behaviour, has a very deep impact on that. But there does seem to be a little contradiction at the moment. So despite them believing that the economy is performing badly, there is no real strong appetite to end isolation at the moment. So 69% of people in the UK disagree that now is the right time to end isolation, and only 17% agree with that statement. Compare that with, say, the US, which is in a similar situation in many respects, which is much more balanced outlook of 47% disagreeing with that, but 37%, so almost 4 in 10 people, agreeing that now is the right time to end the isolation. So when isolation is ended, would you move to the next slide, Alice? Which industries do they think should be lifted first? And what you see in the markets where there is still belief that we're at the peak of the pandemic is that it's heavy industry that gets the public's vote in terms of lifting first. It's manufacturing, it's energy, it's construction. It's those big heavy industries which they believe will drive the economy forward. However, there is also a little bit of recognition on those markets slightly more advanced. So if you move to the next slide, Alice, and we flip across to looking at Hong Kong, the priorities there post-lockdown, sorry, just go back one. The priorities post-lockdown are much more in terms of the restaurant sectors, entertainment, and lifting those industries. And you'll note we've also circled airline and international travel. The reason that features so highly is there is a strong recognition in Hong Kong that they need international travellers and international visitors to drive their economy. And therefore there is a big push and a big desire to open up some of the international travel in Hong Kong, to open it up to those international travellers that drive the economy. And we'd expect to see the same here. And there's a bit of good news coming down the line in terms of Hong Kong's appetite to go abroad and start spending money again, which I'll come on to later. So given the massive bailouts, the billions that have been committed, and the question mark on how those are going to be repaid, and the support for whether there is, as John mentioned earlier, support for greater government intervention. If you just pop to the next slide, Alice, this is support for raising taxes, and very, very interesting findings. In the UK, and this is net support as well, so that figure on the top one for increasing tax on big technology companies such as Amazon and Google and Facebook, that's a net figure. So 75% more people believe that taxes should be increased on big technology than oppose that in terms of paying down some of the bailouts. The other ones who really come in and bear the brunt of public opinion on this of paying down any debt from the bailouts are the big multinational businesses, and also general increases on tax on big businesses or the wealthy. But really interestingly, those businesses that have done well during COVID, that have benefited from the lockdown and people's consumer behaviour change, the support for increase on taxes for them is less than half that for big taxes on the likes of Amazon. And if you pop to the next slide, Alice, it's not a blanket support for increasing tax. So for smaller businesses, for individuals, and for homeowners, and just for general businesses rather than big businesses, there is not the support as much for increasing taxes on those businesses, and therefore less political cover for politicians to start increasing the onerous payback of bailouts onto those companies. So look, I've run through those quite quickly because I really want to focus on the changes in consumer behaviour. So Alice, if you pop onto the next slide, what we're going to go through in this section, some stuff you're already obviously currently experiencing, which is people's current consumer behaviour in the UK. And I'm going to go through these, even though I'm sure you're feeling it more than we're kind of seeing it in the data. But I'm then going to go on to have a look at what's happening in Hong Kong by comparison, which is more advanced and coming out of lockdown and down to almost zero rates of new infections. So first of all is changes in consumer behaviour. As everyone would expect, people are spending more time watching TV, people are spending more time online, people are spending more time on video calling. But the real winner on this one, and one to pick out, is that lime green line, which is the ordering more from delivery companies. Now, clearly people are still spending, even if not at shops, but there is still consumer appetite. In the last 6 weeks alone, that has jumped 10%, which is a significant shift in such a short period of time, of more people ordering from delivery companies or companies that can deliver and are adapting their working practices to deliver to their homes. So there is still an underlying desire to spend money. There are obviously clearly certain groups of consumers who in lockdown are not having to spend money on transport and commuting to work, are not having to spend money while they're at the offices, and therefore if they're still being paid their salary, they do have money that they can spend and are spending it, but they're spending it in different ways. So in terms of moving on to the next slide, current spending habits in recreation, some of this you would expect in terms of greater amount of spending in terms of entertainment and subscription services to keep us all sane while we are down in lockdown and to entertain the kids rather than homeschooling them just to get through the day. But areas where we would expect and there has been drop-offs are clearly in the bookshops, in the bars, the pubs and nightclubs, and obviously in the live entertainment. And obviously if you move to the next slide, Alice, in restaurants and cafes. As you'll see on these as well, this is more pronounced in the UK than it is in some other comparable markets, such as the US and Australia. And obviously, as Hong Kong is coming out slightly further ahead in the pandemic, that figure has been reduced, but I'm going to dig into that a little bit later. And therefore, also on other spending habits in terms of self-care, if you move to the next one, Alice, again, big drop-offs with regards to beauty products, with regards to hairdressing salons, gyms, home exercise equipment, although interestingly on the home exercise equipment, the reason that figure has dropped despite people being at home and there being a lot of appetite for home exercise equipment has actually been issues with supply chain, and therefore they haven't been able to spend it because people have been out of stock. But also on big luxury items in terms of fashion, clothing, bags, there has been a significant drop-off. And again, the UK has been one of the most affected markets in that. But what happens as we come out of lockdown, and what are we seeing in Hong Kong? Well, I'm sorry to say at the moment, there is still a slow return to consumer appetite and consumer spending. You'll remember the slide earlier on in terms of the big shift in the last week alone in Hong Kong of concerns over future financial security, their future financial situation and their personal finances. And that is still driving a lot of their behaviour with regards to consumer. So the way to read these graphs are, again, the bottom line in each graph is the last week and then goes back week on week. And what we're seeing is very little notable shift in the increase in spending in pubs, bars and nightclubs, or indeed in live entertainment, theatre, cinema and music. And if you move on to the next slide, Alice, the same can be seen, I'm afraid, also in restaurants and cafes, where despite the lift of the lockdown, there hasn't been a rush back to spending money in bars and restaurants as soon as lockdown is lifted, despite obviously offices being back operating, being back full, and people in Hong Kong starting to get back to some kind of normality. And again, Alice, if you move to the next one, in terms of self-care, a little bit of reductions in terms of self-care products, in terms of more people are spending on that. But again, not significant shifts across a lot of consumer lines. Is there a breakdown in terms of age groups that have a greater propensity to start increasing spending? Well, there are some shifts. So in self-care products, it tends to be the younger age groups, so those light grey lines, 18 to 24-year-olds and 25 to 35-year-olds, who are less likely to not be spending, apologies for the double negatives, so more likely to be spending on those beauty products. And the other ones to point out on this in terms of spas and gyms, actually it's the older age groups who want to get back to them rather than the younger ones. And in terms of fashion, it's the younger age groups who are more likely to be starting to spend money again on those nice items of clothes and bags and shoes and accessories. So what does it look like in terms of the UK if we come out, or when we come out of lockdown and after the virus? So these are asking people, forgetting about your everyday costs in terms of food and rent and utilities and that type of thing, on terms of your kind of freedom of spending, what do you want to spend your money on? And that very clear distinctions in terms of much more spending on your hairdressing salons, bars, that type of stuff, going back to restaurants and cafes, bars, pubs and nightclubs. And then there is a bit of a general feeling, I wouldn't mind just getting out of here and getting away from my home and just having a bit of a domestic holiday or an international holiday. But it's also worth looking at that slide in the top right hand corner with regards to Hong Kong. And there is a strong appetite as people come out of lockdown to want to start traveling internationally again. And that certainly is something to tap into with regards to international audiences, welcoming visitors back to London and having the tourists come back and the business executives coming back, which obviously supports the economy of London and the West End. Measures that have been successful and have been introduced in Hong Kong to entice people back to restaurants, entice them back to shops. The top one in the top right hand corner in terms of the mandatory face mask, we don't see that necessarily in Western markets, but certainly in Eastern markets there is a kind of cultural attitude with regards to mandatory face masks in public. But there are measures that businesses can take that can allay people's fears of contracting the virus and trying to prevent that initial concern over health coming back too strongly. So hand sanitizers in shops, every other table rules at restaurants and cafes, which is being fairly strictly enforced. We've got an office in Hong Kong, and certainly reports from the colleagues and our clients over there in terms of spacing people out at restaurants is working quite effectively, but also the kind of rota system in terms of people returning to work and into offices. Those measures you'll see on the left in terms of the Hong Kong are also supported, especially in terms of the hand sanitizers. Just pop back 1 second. Just in terms of the hand sanitizers in shops, the every other rules at cafes and restaurants, and also the other seats on transport and trains and buses in London. Now, just before we move to the next slide, and they are the last two slides, which I just want to focus on because they are deep values that have been affected and are affecting consumers' behaviour. And these ones take a little bit of interpretation in terms of reading. So I'm just going to let you have a quick look at the next slide and then I'll explain how to interpret it. The way to look at this is anything initially in the red stretched circle on the right are values that have been negatively affected by the virus. And the closer to that orange dot they are, the more negatively they have been affected. In terms of the green circle, again, those in the circle have been positively affected. And the closer to the orange dot in the green circle, the more positively those values have been affected. Now, obviously, straight off the bat, you can see that more deep values have been negatively impacted and affected by the virus than have been positively impacted by the virus. And they're the ones that are negatively impacted are values that, if in terms of working to entice customers back and clients back, if your communications and work to do it can neutralize the negative impact of some of these deep values, we are seeing in advanced markets that those types of communications are having far greater impacts in enticing customers back. So being denied that sense of freedom and choice, of feeling safe and secure, and a sense of well-being, if there's anything that you can tap into in terms of neutralizing the negative impact, the more positive effect and the more success businesses are in enticing customers back. The same with the positively impacted one, and the one I would really pick up on this is a sense of pride in the country, because certainly politicians, and we're seeing this across the board, while it may not necessarily be reflected in media reporting, it certainly we're seeing it in polling, that politicians pretty much in all markets are benefiting from a rise in a sense of national pride, that the nation is stepping up and fighting this virus, that society is pulling together on it. And I think tapping into that national pride, the West End being a real kind of flagship, not only of London, but of everything that's great about Britain. And making those arguments not only necessarily to customers and the public, but also to governments will have an impact as governments do start to look at that economic sovereignty of how do they recover and drive forward economically from this, as major global financial centres are going through similar things. And then the second slide that I just want to end on is about consumer priorities. This is a forced choice. So asking consumers, Which are the most important to you? To stay close to your inner circle and deeply loyal to those you know best in your local community, or to widen your horizons, meet different people and see different places? If we take a look at the red line, so 68% of people in the UK at the moment, out of that forced choice, answer that it's more important to stay close to their inner circle and be deeply loyal to those who know best in your community. That hunkering down, protecting what you have type mentality. Only 32% would be talking about broadening horizons, seeing different people in different places. Now, while this may not be surprising, when we asked that question, because we regularly track this question, when we asked that question last year, the figures were almost diametrically opposite to what they are now. And just from a historical touch point, we have not seen these figures as high as this since just post 9/11. That is the last time we saw figures like this. But it is worth also recognising and looking at the Hong Kong, so the light blue line, as they come out of lockdown and do start broadening the world that they're living in, obviously because we're all living in fairly kind of small worlds at the moment, not commuting into work, that restoration of wanting to widen our horizons and broaden the people we're meeting and the places we're going does quickly return. But at the moment, in terms of tapping into consumer priorities, anything's products or behaviour that taps into recognising and acknowledging that hunkering down mentality or the protecting what you have will also reap benefits. It's why we see more consumer spending in terms of DIY, of gardening, improving gardens, that type of thing, improving the immediate environment you're in and protecting and enhancing what you have. That is a very strong driver of behaviour at the moment, and therefore any communication that taps into that, but also taps into the earlier stuff of neutralising the negatively impacted values, will certainly have an impact. And I was just going to end on a final slide, which is just a couple of key insights. So if you can move to the key insights slide, Alice. As I said at the start, as we go through the pandemic, concerns do shift from the immediate health to economic concerns and personal finances, fears over job security, protecting personal finances and future financial security. And that is impacting the speed with which there has been a return to consumer spending. But those deeply held values and wanting to feel safe and secure, and also that hunkering down mentality and protecting what you have, is deeply affecting people's consumers' behaviour at the moment. And therefore, efforts to attract consumers back have got to really tap into those values and neutralise that negative impact that COVID-19 is having. What we are seeing in more advanced markets, so with our clients in Hong Kong and around that region and also in Australia, is that businesses that can understand and get ahead of the game in terms of the consumer behaviour, which is moving very fast, and there are patterns of behaviour that may exist for a couple of weeks and then disappear, that if their businesses are agile enough to spot those early trends, tap into them, and then adapt to future fluctuations, either whether that's through the responsiveness of their supply chains or their consumer insights teams, those are the ones that are emerging fastest and strongest from the pandemic. And then finally, just a word in terms of government. Out of all the uncertainty that we face with the pandemic at the moment, there is one certainty, and that is governments are back in town. They are reaching into areas of our economy and our lives probably we possibly kind of never thought possible, because they are having to implement measures in order to protect us from a health point of view. And that will, at the moment, they will be balancing off both protecting of health as well as driving the economy. And those are two difficult horses to ride at the same time. And therefore, any engagement with government and any efforts to persuade them to take supportive action or not take any action which would be detrimental have got to demonstrate awareness of those health concerns, while also playing in terms of the economic need as well. It is a difficult balancing act, but certainly we're seeing in polling, and it's not included in this because I couldn't cover everything in it would take 15 hours to kind of cover all the data that we're getting at the moment. but trust is up with governments. They're looking for governments to lead. They are listening to governments more. It's one of the reasons there's such high increase in TV viewing, is because people are tapping in to hear directly from government, to hear the facts untainted and not through necessarily any kind of media prism. And therefore, certainly governments are setting the bar in terms of how the public respond and how the public behave. And they do have increased trust, and they are looking to businesses, looking to governments to lead. And that will affect businesses because they will have the political cover and support to take quite far-reaching measures that maybe we never thought possible, but that could have significant impacts and ramifications for business. But they are riding a twin horse at the moment in terms of protecting health and driving the economy, and therefore efforts to persuade them to do the right thing with regards to the West End do need to recognise that, and certainly messaging needs to play both on the economic need and also allaying health concerns. So Jace, thank you very much for the time. Obviously happy to answer any questions that you have with regards to that. I appreciate we kind of raced through quite a lot of data there, but we do have a store of data that kind of backs this up. So if there's any other questions that you have that weren't covered by this, we may well have data on it as well.
Sam, thank you very much indeed for that. Just a reminder that we do want your questions. You can put them to the panel from CT Group just by clicking on that hand icon, the question mark icon, and typing in your question. And actually all three of the panelists are there for questions. There's one that I'd like to start off with. I'm actually going to put this to, I think to John. This is probably best for you. The question is, and it's from someone who's remaining anonymous, is there any general information that you may have gathered from other fellow retailers in the district regarding steps to coax customers in store, and if they're considering to start with seasonal sales? Have you done anything along those kind of lines, John?
Well, I don't actually think seasonal sales are going to be a driver for people coming in back into their shops. As you can see from the data that's being provided, they need to feel safe. And I think you can pick it out in age groups as well, because I think the younger generation are keener to come in. They feel less at risk, but they are more financially challenged than the older generation. The people who've got the money to burn are the over 55-year-olds, which is some data we've got, but wasn't part of this presentation. They're going to be less likely to want to come in the older you are to spend your money, because they will still feel vulnerable come what may. They will want to see what measures are being put in place to encourage them to come and spend their money. It's not necessarily, well, here's a sale, come in. I'm sure most people have been inundated with emails from various retail institutes with back event sales, so that people have had that opportunity. In terms of the experience of going into the West End, and I think the advantage the West End's got, it's open air, and the public do feel safer in open air, and that's going to be a challenge for the Westfields of this world, because it's an enclosed space. People are going to have a very different view to going back to Westfield than they are to the centre of London, where it's open and they feel safer in open air before they even go into a retail unit. But I think it's going to be measures such as the yellow brick road measure, which is you follow a track line and you keep your distance and you waddle through a shop unit. I think the bigger units are going to have to look at more spacing on their large retail floor plates, so people feel safer that they can distance themselves more. That hand sanitizer at the bottom of each escalator, that they feel safer about doing that. It's measures like that that's going to instill confidence in people to come and spend their money, and they're interested to see how the West End is going to react and how they're going to welcome back with those measures. I think hotels can do things as well in terms of international visitors. Have your meal in your hotel room, so you're not sort of there doing your bed and breakfast, and you're in the peak morning time where you get up and have your breakfast or evening meal, that you can have your meal. So I think there's a series of measures that need to be put in place to give the public confidence to come in, and to be honest, reducing the cost of products is not going to save people's business plans either. So you need to charge the going rate to save your business.
Interesting points there. I'd like to put this next question to Gavin. The question is from Paul, and it is this: how much does what consumers are doing in lockdown translate into what will consumers do after lockdown?
Yeah, Martin, that's probably one more for Sam, who's closer to the data, but I think some of this is predictive. But I'm going to let Sam take that question because he's closer to the data as it is.
Sure.
I think, look, it's absolutely right that polling, you can't predict what the future is going to be through polling, and that's why we're polling in markets that are more advanced. We were surprised to see that once the lockdown was lifted in Hong Kong, there wasn't more of a return to consumer spending. Certainly our clients over there are reporting that the shops are busier, that the restaurants are busier, but the spending is not happening at the same pace. So while there is more bodies and more footfall, that's not necessarily converting into tills ringing. However, and this is outside of our data, but it was from some work that we have been briefed on in terms of some work in China. What they are seeing in the Chinese economy is an increase in consumer spending, and it's starting to take off, certainly in terms of luxury goods and across luxury lines in fashion and along those lines. And certainly some economists are anticipating that once the borders between China and Hong Kong open up a bit more, that return to consumer spending will start seeing that effect in Hong Kong as well. And I think one of those indicators in terms of life starting to return back to normal will be that international travel element. We're already seeing some stories in the media in the UK with regards to whether there's going to be a kind of complete blanket quarantine for people coming in or returning to the UK, or whether there are going to be air bridges. But I would certainly anticipate seeing in the next 2 or 3 weeks through this tracker of what's happening in terms of consumer spending in Hong Kong as some of those borders start opening up, because we're seeing early signs of it in China.
Thank you for that. I'm going to put this question again to Gavin. It's a different question, obviously, but please feel free if it's not specifically for you. I just want to try and bring you all in to the discussion. The question is from Carlos, and the point that he puts is there any hope for business models that depend on large numbers of people, like bars and clubs? And I mean, looking at some of those graphs in your presentation, it didn't look like there was much good news coming out of countries which had gone into the COVID-19 crisis before us. But it'd be interesting to hear either from Gavin, or one of the others.
Thanks, Martin. I think the lessons that we take are that we're attempting to not predict too much, but look at the evidence that's presented in the territories that are ahead of us in the curve of the virus. And as Sam's just alluded to, Hong Kong's probably as good a place to start with answering that question as anywhere. I think what we're seeing is that things aren't coming back as quickly as the people coming back would suggest. And I think, from the West End's perspective, I think it's going to have to consider what the new normal looks like, certainly in the short to medium term, and aligning to what John was talking about there about specific measures which the infrastructure around bars, shops and cafes can take, as well as considering what happens inside those buildings and those locations where people do go for bars, clubs, live events, etc. So I think there's going to have to be a reaction from the market and from the providers of these services, whether it be nightclubs, bars, restaurants, shops, as to how they can facilitate. It's about confidence ultimately, and how can operators in these spaces give consumers confidence that they can come back in reasonable numbers. But certainly the experience immediately looking at the data from across the globe, which our polling shows, is that unless the market actually proactively seeks to change things, business as usual doesn't appear to be bringing consumers back in the same numbers as they are being released from the lockdown the lockdown procedures that governments are executing currently.
Thank you for that. This question I'd like to put to Sam. It's from John, and I think we've touched on elements of it already, but there might be some other points it triggers you into discussing. The question is this: Hong Kong is only just starting to come out of lockdown. Can we see any small trends in the short term that give some idea of what will be happening in 6 to 12 months?
I was going to say 6 to 12 months in the UK or 6 to 12 months in Hong Kong. I think Hong Kong, there are two elements with regards to Hong Kong, and this isn't necessarily from the data, but it's from qualitative and anecdotal data that we get because of our offices there. There have been people back in offices for quite a while, but the kind of fully fledged return to the office has only just started. Hong Kong, in some respects, has a slightly different element to it because it has undergone some significant economic upheaval prior to the pandemic. And I would be probably more looking with regards to some of the economic data coming out of China and looking to see what we see in Australia and perhaps a little in the Middle East, and look at that economic data as to what's happening, and therefore what could it be expected to be seen in the UK as we move forward. I think in terms of actual consumer behaviour, just purely from release of lockdown, I think Hong Kong is a good analogy. But I think looking that further into the future, you'd need to be starting to look at the economic data to give some kind of foresight on that, and then mixing it with opinion research.
Okay, I'd like to put this question as well to you, Sam. It's from Jenny, and she says, anecdotal evidence in China seems to suggest that after a few weeks out of lockdown, things are almost back to the same as before COVID-19. I wonder whether some people might disagree with that analysis, but let me pick up with the rest of the question. Do you think that will happen in the UK after a few months?
I was on a webinar last week where an economist was suggesting that economic activity in China would start recovering through this year, but wouldn't return to pre-COVID levels until first quarter, second quarter next year. Now, I merely repeat that information. I'm not an economist. I'm not going to. It's not my area of expertise. I think the key thing is going to be how quickly in the UK we can get on either a very fast testing program to understand kind of spread and how it moves around, or in terms of a vaccine. Certainly in terms of Hong Kong, as you saw right at the start of that slide, they experienced far fewer infections, or certainly mortality rates. China is obviously slightly different, but more advanced in it. I think in the UK, we are in a slightly different phase. And I think in terms of customer confidence and allaying the concerns, one of the big steps forward will be either the testing, whole-scale testing program, or a vaccine for it. That's where there will be big kind of steps.
Okay. This question I'd like to put to John. It's from David Shaw. Thank you for a fantastic presentation. You mentioned with regard to influencing government the importance of demonstrating economic need and allaying health concerns. The property owners are in severe financial difficulty because government prevents owners collecting money from tenants. How should the property owners best demonstrate economic need and allay health concerns? That question, if you can answer it, John.
Good question, David. I expect you to ask a question like that. I think what businesses need to do is they need to remind the government how businesses reacted to the credit crunch. They didn't throw tenants out of their premises. In the main, most owners had a mature conversation with their tenants about reduced rent, and even a lot of tenants during the first couple of years after the credit crunch were on free rents and sharing their books all on a monthly basis. So whenever they climbed out of the crisis, they started charging rent again. So business owners gave a very mature response to the credit crunch crisis. that businesses need to remind the government what happened then, that there didn't need to be a draconian government intervention like has just happened, and therefore it is safe to remove this safeguard for tenants to allow for a proper conversation to take place, because tenants, it's too much stacked in the tenants' favour at the moment. So I agree with David's concerns, but I think there's a way to get the message over to the government.
Okay, thank you for that. I'd like to put this question to Gavin. It's from someone who's remaining anonymous. And we've kind of, I think, addressed this question, but I'll put it to you just in case there's some other points that you want to add to it. Is the current situation likely to have a lasting positive impact on retail parks, given the access to free parking and larger store formats where social distancing should be easier, or will it just be a short-term bounce?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Martin. I think it is a slight variation on what we've discussed. I mean, as a group and as a business, CT Local, which is the group that I lead with John, our client base is varied from retail park owners, shopping centre owners, and all of the types of some of the types of outdoor retail parks that have been mentioned, as well as, I guess, the questioner is including in that big supermarket, superstores. And I think what we're getting back from our client base is that there's a sense that people have rediscovered the value of going to the supermarket as a sort of social activity. Perhaps it was more akin to what we used to do in the 70s, 80s and 90s, that's gone slightly out of fashion in the last 15 or so years. So I mean, again, this would just be anecdotal from client feedback, but our sense is that certainly big box retail and a larger out of town supermarket type offer in the short to medium term is going to be very much back in vogue, and is an opportunity for those asset classes to recoup some of the challenging times they've had in the last sort of five plus years. But is it a long-term sustainability play? I would question that, because there's been a flight to disposal of a lot of those asset classes for housing, certainly in secondary and tertiary locations. So it might be a short-term band-aid, but I don't think it has long-term sustainability prospects.
Okay. Martin, can I just add something from the data? I think obviously at these kind of times it's always difficult in terms of what can actually be done, because there is so much government intervention necessarily because of the environment. But go back to that slide, sorry, not literally, but remember the slide with regards to staying close to your community or broadening your horizons and meeting new people. If your communication taps into that and really does focus with regards to community strengths, community values, and being part of a city, but also very distinct neighbourhoods, there is clearly an appetite for that at the moment. It's a deeply held value among consumers, and tapping into that value with communications does provide a mechanism with which to connect better with consumers for a longer term and deeper relationship. So I think there's always a kind of risk of thinking there's not much that can be done at the moment because the government has necessarily brought in certain measures. But that doesn't mean that stopping communicating with consumers and tapping into some of those values that they feel very strongly about and is driving their behaviour won't reap rewards down the line.
Okay, question here from Simon, and I think I'd like to put this to you, Sam. Have any re-emerging international markets shown any indication of what's best? Start as soon as you can, independently or with others, to try and bring consumers spending some profitable money, or wait until consumer demand is much clearer and open on a more definitively, collectively agreed worthwhile date in the future? I hope you followed the thread of the question. Yeah. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, I think it kind of returns to an earlier point, which the return to consumer spending, yes, is being driven by financial concerns and future financial security, but it is not as though people aren't spending when they have access to it and it's on stuff that they currently want, which is being driven by their values. I think certainly what we're seeing in China, what we're seeing in Hong Kong, is that people are spending in certain pockets, but that is moving around very fast. And therefore, the businesses that are most agile and responding to those immediate needs, and maybe that does mean kind of flipping around and being adaptable, but those are the ones that are responding fast enough. There was a factory in China that immediately after lockdown, the workers returned quickly to the factory and just basically started up manufacturing, started up the kind of rotors straight away again. But it was on products that consumers didn't want, but they recognized that very quickly after a week, changed their manufacturing to another product that was being that was highly sought after, and have done very well out of it. Now, I appreciate that is difficult necessarily in certain markets, but understanding there are fluctuations and consumers are still spending, but what they're spending on is changing quite rapidly, and being agile and adapting to that is the key to it.
Okay, we've got time for just 2 more questions. This one from someone who is remaining anonymous. Moving forward 6 months from now, or even 12 months, when all the safety measures have been taken care of for social distancing and personal care inside the stores and out, what will an ideal in-store experience look like? I think that is a question for John.
Actually, I'd go further than that and say what's it going to be like outside, because I think in order to relaunch the West End and say come back and shop in the West End, that it's better that there's almost an announced date for it, and there's a group agreement across West End retailers for it. And to my mind, the ideal launching pad would be, and Jace will know this one very well, but we used to close a West End street on a Sunday to encourage people to come and enjoy Regent Street, Oxford Street, etc., and it was safe from traffic. I think that is a way to say, for the reboot of the West End, let's close down some of these streets, or do Oxford Street on one Sunday and Regent Street the next. That way the consumer will feel safer, because they can circulate, because they know these are very busy streets, that they can circulate across the whole street and get into those shops, and they will feel that they can do safer social distancing. And what leads off that is it's word of mouth. People say, well, I was in X shop and it was very safe the way they had conducted the shop. It wasn't as crowded. The racks weren't so close together. I felt safe. They had the hand sanitizers, etc. So I think we've got to look at a little bit outside the box in terms of what we can do. It is going to be more difficult for smaller shops, but to an extent, small shops and businesses have to operate differently. Large retail units have got floor space to spread things out a little bit, whereas smaller shops, it is going to be a case of people queuing outside the front and be let in 1 or 2 at a time, which actually has worked very, very successfully. I think we also need to look at the use classes order and look at a bit more flexibility, that if businesses have failed and you've got a small restaurant, and you could expand, at least temporarily, into the adjoining one to spread out your tables and chairs, because you may have a small business where you need them all to be occupied. If you can take over the next door business, if it has failed, to expand your tables and chairs, still the same kitchen, same vent in the original premises, I think that's going to help as well. So I think there's a whole bucket of things that we need to look at in order to relaunch the West End.
One last question, which I'd like to actually put back to you again, John. I think you covered some of the points in the answer you just gave, but there might be some new material that you want to add on the back of this. It's from Lee, and he says, how do you see the difference in the public's view of department stores versus smaller shops in terms of feeling safe?
Yeah, I think I think that's further research, to be honest with you, is to get that public perception is what's their view going to be on going to a big store or queuing outside a small premises where you're let in a few at a time. I do feel it's going to be the yellow brick road approach for large stores, that you've got to go in a certain direction on each floor in order to ensure there is a bit of social distancing there. But I think that is one that's very, very difficult to predict. what people have got to remember, and what is your unique selling point about the West End? Why do people want to go to the West End? They want to go to the West End because it's the all-round experience. It's not to do with a particular shop. They go because of the theatres, because of the bars, because of the restaurants, etc., and events that are held throughout the year in the West End. We've got to look at that special DNA of the West End and say, what can we do to make sure people feel the West End still special? Let's have the cinemas open with you book seats in groups and there's distancing between them, so they know they can do a bit of shopping and go and see a film. And we need to do something for the theatres as well, because I fear no theatre is going to be opening any time this year, and it'll be early next year at the earliest. But we need to look at all the facets of the West End, the retail, the bars, the restaurants, the hotels. They all need to work together because it's the sum of its parts that make the West End so special.
On that note, we will leave it there. Gavin Stollar, John Walker and Sam Lyon from CT Group, thank you all very much for that fascinating discussion. Next week, our guest will be Paul Scully MP, the Retail Minister and the Minister for London throughout the COVID-19 lockdown. New West End Company has been speaking every week with the Minister to discuss business support, reopening and the long-term recovery. The Minister will be giving an update on the government's position on reopening and his thoughts on the future of retail, as well as answering your questions. Join us if you can on Wednesday, the 27th of May at 4 p.m. For now, thank you for joining us. Goodbye and keep safe.